Pray that back in Joshua again, chapter 4 today. You know, there's a large concern in the Christian churches in America today in regards to the retention of children in the church. Across every denomination, it's just, the statistic is that children who have been brought to church by their parents, by the time they hit high school and college age, only about 22% remain attending church after that. It's pretty high. It's even worse in other areas. One of the other statistics, I was researching that for this lesson this week, and there's some interesting things. I looked up, Promise Keepers has some surveys, and Baptist Press does, and Lifeway Research, I think was the other one I looked up. But the correlation between parents bringing children and their future staying in church is really unique. One of the things that I found interesting, well, there was one survey that they took. If a child is the first person who accepts Christ in a family, only 3.5% of the rest of that family will follow that child in faith. If a mother is the first person to be saved, only 17% of the rest of the family will follow them in faith. But if a father is the first in a family to be saved, 93% of the rest of that family will follow. That's how much of an impact fathers have in regards to the spiritual condition of children. And that, well, I might share some other statistics because I was later on, but I found that interesting, that huge disparity between mothers and fathers and the influence of fathers in the life of children and in the life of the church, actually. So today we're going to look at my lesson I entitled Memorials and Landmarks. It's a chapter about picking up rocks, if you look at it. They're going to make 2 piles of rocks. Sounds like a great chapter, right? Oh, follow with me as I start Joshua chapter 4. I'm going to read verses 1 through 9 to start here this morning. And it came to pass when all the people had completely crossed over the Jordan, that the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, Take for yourselves 12 men from the people, 1 man from every tribe, and command them, saying, Take for yourselves 12 stones from here, out of the midst of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet stood firm. You shall carry them over with you and leave them in the lodging place where you lodge tonight. Then Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the children of Israel, 1 man from every tribe. And Joshua said to them, Cross over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and each one of you take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel. That this may be a sign among you when your children ask in time to come, saying, What do these stones mean to you? Then you shall answer them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord when it crossed over the Jordan. The waters of the Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be a memorial to the children of Israel forever. And the children of Israel did so, just as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones from the midst of the Jordan, as the Lord had spoken to Joshua according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, and carried them over with them to the place where they lodged, and laid them down there. Then Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priest who bore the ark of the covenant stood, and they are there to this day. That was Joshua's day, by the way. Now, a couple questions here as I was looking through this. Why 2 piles of rocks? Did you see that? They were told, God told Joshua, after they had selected these 12 men, that they were to pick up these stones and carry them to the place where they were going to lodge that night. Which, by the way, is like 4 or 5 miles away between the Jordan crossing and Gilgal, which is where they lodged. So they were going to carry those rocks that far. And then it tells us in verse 9, Joshua set up 12 more stones in the middle of the river. You see that? So that was in verse 9. So there's two piles of rocks that are going to be made. Later, down starting around verse 20, Joshua actually stacks the rocks at Gilgal and makes a memorial. You know, in your notes, you see there's some pictures of memorials you're all familiar with, probably all of these. And we set up memorials to commemorate certain events and people and so on. And that's exactly what they did. They set them up. Now, as I was studying this, I thought it was kind of humorous. Go back up to chapter 3, verse 12. Right in the middle of the instruction that Joshua was given for how they were to cross this raging, flooded river at the time, there's verse 12. It says, "Now therefore take for yourselves 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one man from every tribe." And then verse 13 picks up the same thing that was going on in verse 11. "And it shall come to pass, as soon as the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth shall rest in the water, that the Jordan of the waters will be cut off." And I thought when I read that initially, I thought, well, that's kind of random. Why'd they stick that in there? Because chapter 4, verse 2 repeats the exact same verse. It says, "Take for yourselves 12 men from the people, one man from every tribe." And that's exactly what verse 12 said in chapter 3. So I thought, well, that's kind of random. Basically, he's given them the instruction on how they are to follow the ark into the river and how they were be able to cross it. And right in the middle of those instructions, he says, by the way, pick 12 guys, one from each tribe, and they got a job to do. Now, whether or not he gave them any more detail at that point, the Bible doesn't tell us that. But then you get down here to chapter 4, and then he says the same thing. Take these 12 hand-picked guys, and then he gives them instruction as to what they're supposed to do. Now, did you notice what it says in verse 3? It says, Joshua said to them, verse 5. Joshua said to them, "Cross over before the ark of the Lord." He's talking to these 12 men. "Your God into the midst of the Jordan, and each one of you take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel." Why in the world would you ever carry a rock on your shoulder? Why would you do that? Yeah, if you're carrying something heavy, it's a lot easier to carry it up on your shoulder. I mean, at work we carry glue lamps sometimes and beams and larger pieces of wood, and if a couple guys are carrying it, if you stick it up on your shoulder, your whole body core supports it. It's a lot easier than right down here, you know, because then it's hard on your back. So what does that mean? A big rock. Now here, this is a guy thing, I guarantee it. They picked 12 men, one from each tribe. They're representing their tribe, right? It's going to be a contest, guaranteed. Everybody's going to try to look at the biggest rock. It's just, there's no question about it. Guys, you know this to be true because, you know, they're going to try to prove something. But here's the thing that I thought was interesting. They had to carry him 4 miles on their shoulder. But apparently, they probably picked the biggest guys. There must have been some instruction about what was going to happen. So they pick these big rocks, they carry them all the way up, and they leave them there. They're told in verse 8 that they, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, and carried them over with them to the place where they lodged and laid them down there. So they laid them there. And later in this chapter, we find that Joshua has them stacked up. Probably Joshua does not do the stacking himself because, you know, he's an 80-some-year-old guy at this point. But nonetheless, he has them done. But now the interesting thing is, my question kept coming back to, why did he stack the pile of rocks in the middle of the river? Any guesses? Or ideas? Because it doesn't tell us. He doesn't tell us that God told him to do that. No, you couldn't even see him after the water returned. When it was down, you might be able to see some of them sticking up. But even at that, I mean, Jordan normally, they say, it's like 3 to 10 feet deep, and that's where he put them in the center, so it wouldn't be much sticking up. It was the other stack that they, look at that verse. Oh, maybe.
Did they cross at the same place the second time?
It was the same spot. It says, both times it says to pick him up where the priest's feet stood.
I mean, there was another time that they had to cross the street. Was it in the same area?
I don't remember
Maybe
that.
it parted.
That was the Red Sea.
But, oh, this is, I thought the Jordan could cross. I can't remember.
Okay, I don't remember him crossing twice. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know why Joshua did that. We are told specifically why they were to set the stack up at Gilgal. In verse 7, or 6, then this may be a sign among you when your children ask in time to come, saying, what do these stones, and I like the way this is phrased, at least in the New King James, mean to you? Then you shall answer them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and it crossed over, and so on. You see, the one stack at Gilgal, which became their point of operation as they conquered the land. The people, the wives and the children stayed at Gilgal, and every time they would go out on a campaign, they would return to Gilgal. That's where they became their point of attack for the land of Canaan. And it was at Gilgal that they stacked up this one particular stack of stones. And so I thought that was interesting, but it still doesn't answer the question, why did he do two? Because it never tells us why.
I don't know, maybe it's, for me, the act of doing it.
Okay.
So, when we were deciding about being missionaries, I kind of did that. And it was in a place I'll never see again.
Okay.
But it was just, I remember that, and it was like, that was the time I said, okay, Lord, I'll do whatever you want me to do, go wherever you want me to go, whatever. I'll never see it again. But it's still a memory for me that I did that as an act of submission.
That's good. Because that's where my lesson's leading, by the way.
Okay.
You know, all of us, without exception, have points in our lives, at least in our spiritual lives, where God has taught us something, we've submitted to something, we've exercised our faith, and those become landmarks, really, in our spiritual walk. All of us have that. The application in this chapter here is you need to share those with your children. We do, our grandchildren, need to know about those stories. Like you just said, that was something that was a point of decision in your life. You know, that is what the instruction given here is all about. They were to do that. You know, turn over to Joshua chapter 2. No, excuse me, Judges chapter 2. That's the next book. Starting with verse 7. So the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord, which he had done for Israel. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant, turn the page, of the Lord, died when he was 110 years old. And they buried him within the border of Ephraim on the north side of Mount Gaash. When all the generation that had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them, who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals, and forsook the Lord God of their fathers. Now, there is a correlation here, because in Joshua 4, they were instructed to share with their children the things that God had done for them. In Judges 2, it tells us that the next generation, that means their children, forgot because they did not know about all the great works that God had done for their fathers. That's a sad commentary, by the way. It really is. And that's even on us today. You know, it's really hard for us many times to share those spiritual decisions because they're personal. And so it becomes more difficult to share them with others. But you know, as I was saying earlier when I was researching this concept of the statistics in regards to why churches are losing so many of their children. You know, the surveys that were out there, was it because, you know, the pastor? Was it because of the music? Was it because of the programs? Was it because of the doctrine? And none of those were the reason. None of them were. You know what the main reason was? Something else replaced that activity. You know, when you're a little child, you know, you play t-ball. And then you get too old, then, you know, you go to soccer. And you get too old, then you go to basketball. And you get too old, then you go to something else. And the surveys indicated that when young people, when they get into high school and college, well, something else replaces attending church, work, other activities. The conclusion is that there is no heart-faith link. And that becomes the issue. There's a bug up here flying, driving me nuts. And that becomes the issue. And why is that? It's not the problem of the church. You know, the conclusion with all the surveys was it's a problem of the fathers. And that's interesting to me. The surveys say this. If a father does not go to church, but the wife does, only 1 in 50 of those children will continue in their faith or in their walk. That's interesting to me. It also says this, that if a father attends church, regardless of what the mother does, whether she comes or she doesn't, if the father attends church and takes his children, 2/3 of those children will continue in church. If only the mother attends church, the father doesn't bring them, 2/3 of them will not attend church later. Those are some pretty crazy numbers if you think about it. It's vitally important that men, as fathers, as leaders in the church, as just attenders in churches, that we share our stories. And it's the same thing for mothers, but men especially, because we have a hard time communicating. I don't know about you, I do. You know, it's hereditary, I guess. My father never shared many stories with me, but he did some. But we need to share those points of our faith with our children and our grandchildren and others, with each other even. And if we don't, then the next generation doesn't see the reality of our faith. You know, I remember 60 years ago, my dad sharing with us, I don't even know what the conversation was, but I remember the story of how he got interested in studying the Bible, and actually he taught the adult Sunday school class in Soap Lake for years. And how he got interested in that and how he came to be baptized. So the story is that, you know, when he was in his early 20s, their pastor was a pastor that founded the church there in Soap Lake and Wilson Creek, and I know he founded the one in North Bend as well. His name was Lyle Bramlett. He started a discipleship program or class with 5 young men. And he took them through a Bible correspondence course from Moody, and he introduced them to Bible study helps. And after that class was over, all 5 of them were baptized in Soap Lake. That's worse than the irrigation ditch, by the way. But that was his story. And it was because of that incident in his life that he became interested in studying the Bible. His influence on all of his sons, all 4 of us, to attend Bible school. Of course, back then it was a lot less expensive. I think I could pay for a quarter for $700 or something like that. It was not bad. I could sell 1 calf and change hand lines for the neighbors and have enough for 2 quarters. But he would pay the difference. And it was that reason, that spiritual point in his life that affected him. So that when he passed away and Mom says, you want any of Dad's books? He had 2 bookcases full of Bible study helps, commentaries. I got all the best ones. But I mean, why? That's because that incident, that thing in his life. But I remember that, and it's been 60 years since he told that story. At the end of his life, I tried to get more details out of him. He couldn't remember anything then, but that's okay. If we do not share those things with our children and our grandchildren and with each other, there is no proof of the reality in our life that our faith is genuine. And I think that is what happened with Israel. You know, they had all kinds of things happened. They crossed this river when it was flooded. The walls of Jericho fell down. All these armies that came against them, they defeated without any loss of life. And you know what? They didn't share that. They didn't share that those were spiritual victories, not strategy military victories. I mean, the taking of Jericho had nothing to do with their ability or their strategic planning. They just walked around the city 7 times, or 7 days. 13 times total. That's all they did. And then the walls fell down. But they didn't share that, apparently. They were supposed to. That's why the memorial was built. You know, even we do. We have points in our lives when their monumental thing took place, when we made a decision for Christ, to follow him, to do something. Those points in our lives are what we need to share with our children, our grandchildren, and each other. It's vitally important. They're memorials to us. And when we share them with our children, they become memorials to them. And they remember them for the rest of their life. Guaranteed. There's another memorial here as you get into chapter 5. Actually, let's finish reading chapter 4, and then we'll get into the first couple verses of chapter 5. Starting with verse 10 of chapter 4. So the priest who bore the ark stood in the midst of the Jordan until evening was finished, and the Lord had commanded Joshua to speak to the people according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua, and the people hurried and crossed over. Then it came to pass, when all the people had completely crossed over, that the ark of the Lord and the priest crossed over in the presence of the people. And the men of Reuben, the men of Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh crossed over, armed before the children of Israel, as Moses had spoken to them. About 40,000, prepared for war, crossed over before the Lord for battle to the plains of Jericho. On that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they had feared Moses all the days of his life. Then the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, Command the priest who bear the ark of the testament to come up from the Jordan. Joshua therefore commanded the priest, saying, Come up from the Jordan. And it came to pass, when the priest who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord had come from the midst of the Jordan, and the soles of the priest's feet touched the dry land, that the waters of the Jordan returned to their place, and overflowed all its banks as before. Now the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they camped in Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up in Gilgal. Then he spoke to the children of Israel, saying, When your children ask your fathers in times to come, saying, What are those stones? Then you shall let your children know, saying, Israel crossed over this Jordan on dry land. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed over. That all the people of the earth may know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. So there's that conclusion of that. They came up out of the water again. And interesting enough, the detail given is the same as the detail going in. In the detail going in, as soon as the priest's foot, the sole of their shoe, touched the waters just were gone. And this time, as soon as their foot, the bottom of their foot touches dry land, the waters return. So conclusion-wise, apparently, God had let that dam go 2 hours before, because it was clear up at Adam. And so that when they stepped out, the waters came back immediately. which is interesting. The timing of God and his whole planning of this whole thing was sovereign, I guess you would have to say. Now we get to chapter 5. Now there's a couple details I wanted to point out as we see this. First of all, we see that all the people have crossed over. Now God gives the command to the priest to come out, but then he gives us a parenthesis that before all the people crossed over, there was this foreguard that crossed over, 40,000 soldiers armed. It says they went before the people and they positioned themselves in a defensive position on the plains of Jericho. Now, why would that be? Well, because, you know, when you're crossing a river, you're most vulnerable to attack because you're in a limited spot and limited defense and you're in the open. And so these 40,000 had gone up, and here they are camped on the plains of Jericho before the city of Jericho, which is their next stop. And so they've gone ahead, and then the priests step out, and then Joshua gives the instruction again. When your children ask your fathers, their fathers, they are to give the answer, this is what God has done for us in the past, and tell them the details of that story. Then you get into chapter 5, where we have another memorial and another odd situation. So it was when all the kings of the Amorites, who were on the west side of the Jordan, and all the kings of the Canaanites, who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan from before the children of Israel until he had crossed over, that their heart melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the children of Israel. Now I'm going to stop there. So we heard earlier when the spies talked to Rahab that everyone in the city had lost heart because they had heard of what God had done to the Red Sea and to the Amorites on the other side of the Jordan River. Now, this whole 200 or 2.5 million people have crossed the Jordan River during its flood time. They're completely demoralized. They're decimated. They're without hope, if you would. Now, logically, it would have been the perfect time to attack, right? Because the enemy's they've given up. They're scared to death. They've just heard these stories. It's all impossible. There's no hope. Now's the time to attack. But God doesn't always operate under human logic. And so we're going to find that instead, they camp on the plain, which is about 2 miles here below Jericho, for 10 days. Man, they're really going to be scared by that time. They can see all these massive people. And it tells us the date they crossed the river, and it tells us the date they, later on in that chapter, that they perform another memorial service, and then they march around the city for 7 days. They're there a long time before they ever attack that city. At least 10 days to fulfill all the stuff that we're going to see happens from here, verses 1 through 13, or 12. So that's the setting. They've crossed, they've gone up to Gilgal. These 40,000 soldiers have camped on the plains of Jericho, and as guards, they've set up this memorial. And then in verse 2, God gives Joshua some more instruction. He said, make flint knives for yourself. All right, what is a flint knife? Anybody? What's that?
A knife made of flint.
Okay, what kind of knife do you think that would be? There you go. It's like shale, split really thin. You can slice yourself on it pretty easy. He says, all right, make flint knives for yourself and circumcise the sons of Israel. Ouch. With a knife made out of rock. The second time, so Joshua made flint knives for himself and circumcised the sons of Israel at the hill of the foreskins. Interesting name. Now, what in the world? Hadn't they been given instructions back in Deuteronomy or someplace, Genesis maybe, I have that reference there somewhere, that they were supposed to circumcise all the male children no later than day 8. Apparently, and we're going to see here in the next few verses, they haven't done any of that for 40 years. Why? Look at the next few verses. And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came up out of Egypt, who were males, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness on the way after they had come up out of Egypt. For all the people who came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the wilderness on the way as they came out of Egypt had not been. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness till all the people who were men of war who came out of Egypt were consumed, because they did not obey the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord swore that he would not show them the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers, that he would give them a land flowing with milk and honey. Then Joshua circumcised their sons, whom he raised up in their place, for they were uncircumcised, because they had not been circumcised on the way. Let's stop there. Why do you suppose? Well, first of all, what was the significance of circumcision to the nation of Israel? Anybody know? Why did God command them to do that? Demonstration of their covenant, yes. It was an outward physical sign of this covenant between them and God. Now, they weren't the only ones that practiced circumcision, but with the nation of Israel, God had put it as a physical sign that they were his chosen people. So now, if that were the case, why didn't they do it for 40 years? What do you think?
Well, besides unbelief, it'd be pretty impractical to out wandering around.
It's really impractical where they're at right now. But yeah, unbelief, I think, is the main thing. They had already broken covenant with God. God had commanded them to take the land, but they didn't believe that they could, that he would. And so they had broken covenant with God. And we're going to see in the next few verses that they not only did not circumcise their males, but they did not practice the Passover as well. They completely quit doing anything. I think it had to do more with they didn't want to be reminded of anything that reminded them of their disobedience to God. So they just didn't do it. None of them had. It's interesting, verse 8 says, so it was when they had finished circumcising all the people that they stayed in their places in the camp till they were healed. Do you remember the story, I think it's in Genesis, about Dinah, who was raped by some Hittite or somebody, Canaanite of some sort, and yet he loved her and he wanted to marry her, and he asked if he could marry her from Jacob, and her brothers, Simeon and Levi, you remember this story? What did they do? They said, okay, you can marry our sister, but we can't let her be married to any uncircumcised person. So if you and all the people in your community, city, will agree to be circumcised, then we'll let you marry our sister. The detail in that story is that they thought, well, that sounds great. We'll do that. They managed to talk everybody in town into doing that. And then it says in that detail of that story, they waited 3 days until the men of the city were in the most pain, and then they attacked them. 2 men, and they killed every male in the city. Now, what I said earlier, they have camped on the plain of Jericho. The enemy is ripe to attack because they're decimated as far as their morality, or their morals. That's not the word either. Morale, there we go. Thank you. I need my wife up here to help me. Their morale is down, and now they incapacitate every man in their midst. Everyone, even the 40,000 that are camped out front, because none of them have been circumcised for at least 4 days, because it tells us in the next verse, verse 9, then the Lord said to Joshua, this day, well, let's skip down to verse 10. Now the children of Israel camped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month. And if you notice down there in verse, what was it, 1? Or was it that talks about the 10th day when they crossed the river? Maybe it's in chapter 4. I can't find it. So it's been at least 4 days, because they didn't keep the Passover when everybody was in pain, or at least all the guys. And so they have put themselves in an extremely unsafe situation. That's all I'm saying. But God commanded it. Because you see, the battle had nothing to do with logic. It had nothing to do with their powers and their strength. It had everything to do with a spiritual battle of faith. They were to trust God completely. We know that in the next few chapters after Jericho, that they used their own logic, and they were defeated at Ai. Because they thought, well, this is a piece of cake, we can take these guys, and a bunch of them died. But this particular thing that's happening now is all to do with memorials, remembering their relationship with their God. He's already established this pile of rocks that they might be able to share God's working in their lives with their children. Now he restores this covenant sign with them so they might remember this covenant they have put themselves under with God. And then he's going to institute, again, the Passover, when they can remember again as a memorial what God has done for them and did for them and their families in Egypt. You know, the whole thing is a point of remembrance and sharing that with their descendants, which for some reason, according to Judges 2, they didn't do that long term. They were doing it here, but after all the battles, they didn't. And so therefore their children all went astray. Their children rejected God, followed the Baals and the Ashtaroths. So they've been circumcised. Circumcision was a decision that each of them made to reestablish and recommit themselves to the covenant that they had with God that was set up on Mount Sinai when they agreed to follow their God, and he was going to be their people and direct them. Now, you know, it's like I said, it really seems interesting that God would choose this particular point in time to do this, but I skipped verse 9, or 8. Verse 9. Then the Lord said to Joshua, this day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Therefore the name of the place is called Gilgal to this day. Now if you have a note at the bottom of your Bible, it says that Gilgal literally means rolling. Now what's he talking about? God says, I'm having you do this right now. And the name of this place you're doing it at is called rolling, because I'm going to roll away the reproach of Egypt. All right, what do you think that means? Any ideas on that one? What was the reproach of Egypt? What was it like for them in Egypt? My daughter says I don't have enough interaction in my Sunday school class. So I'm attempting. They were slaves, that's right. They were slaves. They cried out to God to deliver them, right? And then they wanted to go back. That's crazy.
Thinking about that this morning, one guy was reading in Romans about how we were slaves to sin, but we aren't anymore, but we sometimes act like it.
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah. So I guess the thing I got out of it, because, their freedom from Egypt really was a sign, was a symbolic of our freedom from our sin, our salvation, if you would. Crossing the Red Sea was basically symbolic of salvation itself. They were free from that. And now he's telling them, I'm doing this now because I'm rolling away the reproach. Is that the word that used? The reproach of Egypt. The sin of the past. I think it had actually to do more with the sin of their parents' unbelief. They wanted to go back to Egypt. They came out of Egypt, but they wanted those melons and cucumbers. They thought they forgot all the rest. We tend to do that. We forget the bad stuff, just remember what we want to remember. Right. Right. Yeah. They weren't trusting God. They were trusting logical military strategy. So on the conclusion here of this section, I want to get just to verse 12 today. It tells us, the Lord said to Joshua, this day I will roll away the reproach of Egypt from you. Therefore, the name of the place is called Gilgal to this day. Now the children of Israel camped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho. And they ate of the produce of the land on the day after the Passover, unleavened bread and parched grain. On the very same day, then the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten the produce of the land. And the children of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate the food of the land of Canaan that year. All three of these, the piles of rocks, the circumcision, and the celebration of the Passover, were memorials of God's working in the lives of the people. They really were. The Passover, that commemorated the death angel passing over, the blood on the post, the sacrificial lamb. All of those things were memorials. And it's really similar to what we have here today, the communion service. It's a memorial for us when we too remember God's deliverance of our sin through the work of Jesus Christ and the shedding of his blood. They're memorials to us. This morning I'm standing here, right about here, and my Tori comes running up the stairs, up front here, and she says, "Are we having communion today?" Because she was just baptized last week, and so it's her first time. So she was all excited. Are we that excited? When we think about what God has done for us, are we excited enough to share with our families, with each other, those points in our lives when we made spiritual decisions? Because those are what people will remember. They'll remember those things forever. I've told stories to employees at times, and they'll bring those up, and I forgot about them a long time ago. It's interesting to me what people remember. And it always seems that when you share something that God has done in your life, your testimony, if you would, whether it's salvation or just an answer to prayer, that sticks with people. It becomes a reality. They see what is real in you. And I believe the conclusion of all these surveys I read was that when that is not seen by the children, their faith is not genuine. It doesn't stick. They don't seem to put the link together. Church is just an activity. It's not something you do because you desire to worship your God. And that's what I find to be interesting in this whole message, or whole lesson here that we find in these two chapters. Yeah. That's right.
And so you almost get the impression that the Israelites forgot what God did. I mean, it was so, we look at it and think, oh,
How they forget that.
forget something like this, but it's kind of like it got diminished in their life. And I think that sharing sort of keeps it in the forefront of our
Right.
lives and kind of invigorates our own faith. Remembering is important to us also.
It is. We forget. I mean, I couldn't tell you hardly anything from my childhood because it's just gone, you know. But, you know, really, you should write your family stories down, those things that are important. If you don't, you forget them. It's just life. We get old. Our brains quit working. But nonetheless, I think the challenge is clear here in this passage. They were instructed to do this, and I'm going to kill this fly before I leave today. And they didn't do it. And as a result, the next generation, that's what gets me. It wasn't the grandchildren. It was their children. The next generation forgot God. And that's what I find the most disheartening in this whole lesson, actually. Let's close in prayer today. Father, we do thank you for your word. We thank you that how it challenges us. We thank you how it's interesting as we look at it. And every time we see it, Lord, there's something new. We just pray that you would be with our time together today. Pray that you would be with Kurt today as he brings a message this morning. In Christ's name, amen.